one that surprised me, The View from the Cheap Seats by Neil Gaiman, one of my favorite authors.
Oh, mine too. I love the Sandman series and all the books he's written. I like this one, you know, as a writer, it's always nice to see, or wonderful to see, the how things work. And for him, this is a collection of essays, writings, lectures that he's given. And you see how someone who is a gifted storyteller is able to put pen and paper together to create a world and describe a whole world. And it's like being an intensive course about writing without talking about technical things. It's giving you the insight of how to write from the heart and from the mind. You know, you write with your heart, you edit with the mind. And what drives you to create such worlds? The what if, what is this, what is that, and asking questions. And the answer to those questions will take you in directions that are just absolutely marvelous. You know, it makes you wonder about society. It makes you ask questions about how we've created this society, and how, in the end, it's human beings and human stories that create this society and this culture, and how we can describe those narratives, those myths into our everyday life. And as a writer myself, it's a beautiful window into the creation of inspiration, and what allows you to create a novel, a story, a little book, as small as it may be, to the biggest, thickest thing. It's it makes you write. It makes you want to write.
There's another book which we'll get to a little further on about creativity that you really like. Clearly, this is something that you find very inspirational.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's you know, there's if you follow the pattern of the books, there is a rhythm to them. You know, the Four Agreements talks about your own self and healing. The Born to Run is inspiration. What motivates you to that healing or to that creation? Will Durant is a reflection of the past and learning from our elders. How to Raise an Adult and the Autistic Brain is how to shift your relationship, not just with your children, but with yourself and others, and see it from totally different eyes. Neil Gaiman is exercised in putting all of that into words and a narrative that allows you to understand it, because it's all literature. It's all, whether it's fictional or non-fictional, it is still that ability to put into words that allows each other to understand each other. And that's the gift of literature. We get to understand, because if I don't understand what you're saying, then it goes over my head. But if you have this ability to paint with words this experience, this aha moment, this thought, it can move you. And going back to that image of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and the turning around of someone's eyes and looking at you, and also seeing the moment where love fades or disappears, and it's just in the written page. Wow. It's Neil Gaiman's, this book describes exactly what that power is.
Yeah. The moment when perception shifts. Yeah. So number 7, how would you describe this one then? The Variety of Scientific Experience, a Personal View on the Search for God by Carl Sagan. Published in 2006 on the 10th anniversary of his death by his wife.
So these next two books, Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking. So first, Carl Sagan. I love reading books on physics. And history. Those are my two favorite topics to read in my free time. I spent many a time reading biographies and then reading books on physics, astrophysics, microphysics, and all these things. Carl Sagan in this book bridges two worlds. Now, mind you, in my background, I was born and raised in duality and juxtaposition. My father and my uncles were surgeons. My father, before he was who he is now, Don Miguel Ruiz, was a neurosurgeon, a medical doctor. My mom was a dentist. My uncle was an oncologist. My other uncle was a neurologist. My aunt was is a psychologist. And my grandmother and my grandfather are faith healers. So you have contrast right there of two worlds. And they did not clash. They somehow supported each other. My grandma would send some of her patients my uncles and my father's way, and in turn they would send people over to my grandmother, because sometimes in the root of things there is that thing that heals. Like for me, in my point of view, faith healing is using the placebo effect to help people. You know, a sugar pill given to the right person who has that intent, this pill will help heal me, will be healed. There's the power of the word, there's power of the faith. Going back to words, there it is. The same energy I used to move my arms, to move my legs, is the same energy I used to create a thought. At the root of every belief I have in my belief system, there's a yes that gives it power. So witnessing my grandmother and use faith in that way, and to us, faith is believing in something 100%. It's not blind faith, it's knowing the intent of being able to take a step forward. That's what faith is to us. And she used it. And my father eventually lets go of his medical profession and becomes Don Miguel Ruiz and bridges the two of them together. And then I lived in San Diego, California, and I went to school in Tijuana, Mexico. So I lived in the United States, but went to school in Tijuana. So I grew up with two languages that I use, you know. To this very day, I dream in English and I count in Spanish. It's how my brain works. All right, Carl Sagan's, this little book is exactly that. He talks and bridges the world of physics and understanding the universe, and then talks about God and how he bridges those two things in a series of lectures. And what is pivotal in this book is, in the end, they collected all the questions and answers of each night. The people who agreed with his thesis and presentations and arguments, and people who didn't. And he talks about science and spirituality in a way that to me is graceful. He's not afraid to shy away of the disagreement between the two of them, but by its nature, he obviously doesn't separate them completely, because there's still this approach and acknowledgement of God. So from that point of view, this book describes a duality, a juxtaposition, to try and find a common language, not only to understand the world, but sharing that knowledge with everyone else. And people will have a totally different point of view on what you're saying. So in that question and answer section in the end, you can see how he navigates. There are people who agree and there's people who completely disagree, and how he's able to weave between them through words that allows him to bridge. Cosmos is the series that he was the host from, is exactly that. You know, it's to a certain degree, he's talking physics in a way that we can all understand. So when he talks about God as a physicist, it's an extraordinary thing in the desire to create that bridge of those two worlds that allows us to understand not just the cosmos, but that which is the divine. So it's a book that leads to the other book, which is A Brief History of Time, which is Stephen Hawking. But before I go into that one, this book is just how you see a master navigate two worlds and find a common place where we understand each other. And talking about physics and the space we're in, the universe, and the micro and the macro, and where's God's place in it.
Yeah, I can see why you really love that book. So tell us about History of Time. You've already said you love reading about physics. You did say that you had to read a lot of books to be able to read that one.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing. Like with going back to Carl Sagan for a brief moment, as a teacher myself, and I'm teaching my family's tradition, Carl Sagan is a good inspiration or a good teacher because he paved the way of how to bridge. And my father did the same thing with the Four Agreements. The Four Agreements, it's he when he began to teach the Toltec tradition, he saw that there was a lot of superstition. So he took out a lot of the superstition and put what he calls common sense language. And that's coming from a doctor. So in the Four Agreements, the only thing left of the old Toltec stories is the intro of the story of the smoking mirror. The rest is the Toltec tradition stripped out of the superstition, and all that is left is common sense. It's simple. It doesn't talk down to anyone. It's written in a way that is we can engage, and Carl Sagan does that in a beautiful way. Stephen Hawking also does it, but Hawking tackles something that is so complex that I did read Neil deGrasse Tyson. I read I forgot the name of the Italian author. He writes the short little books, and then of course the big thick books of history. I began to tackle A Brief History in Time years ago in my 20s, and I'll tell you, it just went. I didn't understand it, and I thought it was beautiful, but I had the desire to understand what he's talking about. So I wasn't afraid to start from the very beginning all over again. And to be honest with you, physics wasn't always my strong suit. I was definitely more into the visual arts. I studied at school. I studied film and video production. I started out as a sociology major, but I switched to film and video production with a minor in theater, and I kept my social. I still took a lot of sociology, so that's my craft. But I've always had this intrigue since I was in the International Baccalaureate in high school, where it's like in the International Baccalaureate you kind of focus on so many things, and I focused on history, I focused on literature, but I couldn't help but be intrigued by physics. I have math. I was getting straight A's in math up until calculus, and I never was able to get past the C. But I read books in physics only to be able to understand Stephen Hawking. And mind you, Stephen Hawking does a great job of doing what Carl Sagan does, which is to talk in a language that anyone can understand. And this is probably the reason why he became such a big superstar, is that he was someone who has such an incredible intellect, but didn't talk down to anyone. Here it is, here's the information, and here's how it pertains to the world and the universe in his case. And I read all these books, and when I felt I was reading, I was ready for it, I began to read A Brief History in Time again, and I understood him. I was able to tap into his imagination, what it means by the singularity and multiple singularities, and what is a black hole, and how does that relevant to time, and how we perceive time. And also it's a way to describe the universe and the movements and the actions and the expansion and the contraction of it, that it's humbling. You look up in the stars and you see everything he wrote about flowing right in front of you. The stars, how we're basically seeing a sea of corpses. Some of those stars no longer exist, but it took this much time to reach it, and some of the lights are flickering because there's something in front of it. And there's the time-level concept of understanding what a Big Bang is and how that happened, and the singularity of all this pressure coming in, and then all of a sudden one variation, and then it'll come back down. Now the whole concept of space and singularity. So it makes you understand that as soon as you shift perception, for example, if we shift our perception in the universe, it'll still look dramatically different. It changes. Perception will always change. Your reference in time will change according to where you're at. As simple as I'm aging more being at 5,000 feet here in Reno than I was when I was living in San Diego at sea level. You know, that little difference affects my body in time and how the body relates to it. Let alone the experiments are having with the astronauts. You know, the twins. One
Yes.
stayed on Earth, one went up, and his DNA changed. And the funny thing is that as soon as you begin to understand Stephen Hawking, you begin to understand Einstein, because Einstein did it with all his imagination. And all of a sudden you realize it's you go down to Newton, you go down to all these wonderful minds that began to explore it. And you know, a TV show called Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson puts it all into perspective. It's a beautiful way to see your place in all creation, where Will Durant's book describes your place in society in the form of history. Stephen Hawking shares the spot where you're at in the universe, and how we are. I'm going to quote Neil deGrasse Tyson in this one. We are made of star stuff, and why that is, and the all the energy in the universe equals zero. All the energy in the universe equals zero. The manifest and the unmanifest. My father talks about this all the time. All that exists is the manifest and the unmanifest. And then Stephen Hawking, the way he described it, it is everything is positive and negative. And so positive being all this energy that came together to create matter, and then in the same time, it is able to disintegrate into nothing. So it's all the energy, positive and negative, or you can say amassed by gravitational pull, whatever you want to call it, to that which has no form, gravitates to zero, which means we'll all go back to one.
So number 9, wow, this was named a most anticipated book of 2018 by Esquire, Pop Sugar, the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed and Publishers Weekly. Creative Quest by Amir QuestLove Thompson. Musician, band leader, designer, producer. Talk about creativity. I mean, this man does everything.
Yep.
All-round cultural omnivore, culinary, entrepreneur, professor. My goodness.
And he's a drummer too.
And he's a drummer. Yes, absolutely. Maybe that's how he became so creative.
Yeah, the rhythm, you know, like it's the rhythm, it's the foundation, the rhythm and the bass.
Yeah.
Like I said, like I wrote, I haven't finished reading this book. And the reason why I haven't finished reading this book is that every time I pick it up, I put it back down to do something. It's a book that makes you do stuff. It's like you look into his world, you get inspired by what he's doing, that you put it down to put into use. And you don't have to actually do what he's actually doing. Like, for example, there's times when I've been reading this book and all of a sudden I put it down and I'm going back to working on my own book, and then, or something that inspires me with my son. Let's go do this. Let's do that with my kids. Let's go do this with that. It's a book that set up the what if and actually lays out the plan of making it so, and not be afraid to make it so. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid of your own judgment. It's kind of like when you write. It took me a long time to not edit as I'm writing, to trust in the purge. I call it a purge, at least. I throw up all these thoughts, all these words. I write and write and write and write and write. It doesn't have to be grammatically correct. It doesn't have to be profound. Doesn't have to be beautiful. It could be a whole run-on sentence that lasts 2 pages. All that matters is that you put it on paper. Create this clay. Once you finish creating the clay, you hit save, walk away. Then when you're ready, you come back and you begin to introduce order, in the sense of put it grammatical rules. Create the sentences, create the paragraphs, give it structure. Don't erase anything, just put it into shape, hit save, walk away. Once that thought is over, come back later, and each one, you never touch the masters. You never touch each layer. Like, if you created the clay, You never, all you hit is copy and save, never touch that again. Put grammatical rules in this particular one, hit save, never touch it away. Copy and paste, now you start editing. And you edit because the reason why the first two drafts are such a mess is because you only have one reader and it's me, and I'm able to fill in the gaps. But you begin to edit because now the reader is no longer me, it's someone else. And the rules of grammar are there to help convey that message. So that's why we edit. The book or your essay has to stand alone because it doesn't have you to answer questions. It has to stand on its own, which means when you edit, you're translating it into a language someone else can understand. That's the creative process. Yeah. That's, you first let the thought out, and it'll stick with you because it'll resonate with you all along the way. QuestLove's book is about that thing that galvanizes you to even begin to put down the clay down, to create the clay, create all this thoughts, all these movements, all this heart, and let's see where it goes. If it resonates, if it has a heartbeat. And that's when I say heartbeat, it's just another way of saying it resonates, but it has a way to describe something that you're passionate about and you want to see it through.
So he's an inspirer.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
He's a muse in a great way.
Yeah, yeah. So the last book, interesting one again, Can't Hurt Me, Master Your Mind and Defy the Odds by David Goggins, published in 2018.
So like we said before, like we were talking about in a question about filling out this, one of the things, how these books come into your life. The Four Agreements came to my life because my father's the author. Born to Run is because my friends Shane and Brian, we both went for a run. Will Durant came to my life because my best friend is his great-grandson. How to Raise an Adult came because I was going through some anxiety, and that phrase, survive without me, came into my mind. That's Autistic Brain. My son has autism, and I kept looking for a light. Neil Gaiman came because I love the Sandman stories and I love his stories, and this book came into my life because I just wanted to read more by him, and it's just been an absolute treasure. Carl Sagan, Cosmos. I enjoy the TV show, both the original and the newer version, and I just wanted to know what is about him. I wanted more. Stephen Hawking is just a man who just, he went through so much, but just this book itself is just something that's been in the lore of our society, and I want to know. QuestLove, I saw it in a bookstore, I picked it up, and I couldn't put it down. I was in Portland, Oregon, and I forgot the name of the bookstore, Powell's. I was in Powell's in Portland, Oregon. I picked it up, and it never left my hands after that. David Goggins, Can't Hurt Me, came to my life because my friend Brian, he gave this book to me. It was Brian is, for many years, he's an avid runner, and he finally qualified for Boston. And in that time, he was looking for, books that him and I share a lot of books and running and all these kind of things. And, my brother gave me a book for Christmas called Life with a Seal. And it talks about this adventures of this enterprise businessman who sees this one Navy SEAL do a crazy race, 100 miles in San Diego Bay, going around in circles, and he goes, who is this guy? So he has them come train him for a month, and he creates this blog, and he published a blog. And he didn't name my name, but in this particular edition, he finally decided to give it. So he says David Goggins. I give this book to Brian, A Life with a Zeal, And Brian in return comes back and says, here, he released a book. Really? I read it. It is the most in your face, hardcore. He pulled no punches. You know, it's not elegant, it's not beautiful, but man, he describes the hardship he had to go through. You know, living with his father was abusive, who was friends with Rick James. You know, the guy who sings "Super Freak." He's super freaky, ow, dun, 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 and describes growing up in that environment of heathenism, I guess you can describe it, but basically a very tumultuous family life, and he wasn't supposed to amount to anything, and then he is moved to the Midwest, where he's probably the only black person in that little community, and he experiences racism in a way that's just dramatic. So he goes after trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, and the way he got out of it was with his body, athleticism, and he decided to there was a recruiter, a military recruiter, that kind of spoke to him and opened up his possibilities in the military. And at that point he already had a kid. He was in a marriage that was loveless, and but he decided to go for it, and discipline was introduced into his life, and it changed him completely, to the point where, to a certain point, a little obsessive of trying to reach all these goals, but he was able to run some of the most toughest races in the world, and he learned it by experience, and he just kept going and going, and all along, in order for him to achieve it, he had to change himself, and he overcame all that. You know, he became this holder of records of not just running but pull-ups and things like that. He's in phenomenal shape. But then the main the main part of this book was not just his ability to overcome all his excuses to not do anything, but then he achieves it, and his body begins to break down because yes, he worked and worked and worked, but when he was a SEAL, a man came to give a class about stretching, and he disregarded it because, like, I don't need to stretch, you know. And funny, my wife is the same way. She's like, oh, we can. She runs like a cheetah, my wife, but she never stretches, and I stretch. But he's the same mentality. I don't need to stretch. And then when he got hurt, and his body began to lock down because all of a sudden he was so tight. His body was so tight that blood wasn't circulating so well. So his body was starting to break down. And then he remembered this lecture, and it was like a seed that blossomed. I need to take care of myself. So he began to stretch and stretch and stretch. And all of a sudden, he went from almost dying to once again running, but now he has this balance. He found this balance that allowed him to continue doing it. And to this day, if you go to his Twitter or Instagram account, you can see him still, you know, he routinely gives advice to people about staying in your discipline, staying in what you want to attain in life, and is a motivational speaker in this way, and motivates so many kids, especially when he shares the story that, like, you know, I was supposed to be this gang member, I was supposed to be nothing, and here I am. Look at everything I've created, not in form of riches, but in his own craft. Man, it inspires you to go out there and start running. In my case, and that was the original intent, but I used it for so many other things. It reminds me of a teacher once taught me this lesson. The key to enlightenment is effort. That's it. That's all she said. And this is in Mount Shasta in a lecture. She said this. And I began to process that line. Effort is using the energy that animates this body. It's the energy to apply, to take one step forward, one step forward. That's what effort is. Discipline is simply remembering to apply that effort every day. That's all discipline is. And success is following through. That's what I've understood from her teaching in this book. It's kind of like my father's book, Always Do Your Best. It's in the four agreements, there's a one little chapter that talks about always doing your best. Well, David Goggins' book it's all about that. It's about love, in a sense of letting go of all these things that stops you from doing.
Yeah.
And that's my interpretation of it, of course. But in my point of view, it's that it's a story that if you allow the projected image that your surrounded gives you, then you will always be trapped by it. But if you're willing to break out of it, and yes, it's gonna be difficult at times, you can achieve so much. It's a certain degree. This book, it's like if you look at these 10 books, they're all correlated. They're all intermatched. The autistic brain and combined with Can't Hurt Me. Yeah, it's the thing that I'm not gonna stop autism from being my son's father, but and autism is not gonna be the thing that stops him from being who he is. We're gonna break through the projection, and all of a sudden you realize that the projection that people have is that autism is your tyrant, but if you break through that, autism is your ally. It'll give you strength. And it's exactly that. It's like it's a humble story of someone who didn't let that projection affect him. Yes, he has issues. He's not a perfect guy. He has his relationships with his partners fall apart here and there, but eventually it works out. It's a work in progress. And to me, it's one of the most inspiring books I have ever read, because he never pretends to be this type of guy. He always describes himself as this guy who didn't have better, but he got there in a way that is unorthodox. And you can say that if someone used their time meditating, he used it by moving. And
it reminds me of the saying that the only failure is not trying. Yeah, I mean, it says the notes that I looked up said that he says that most of us tap into only 40% of our capabilities. He calls this the 40% rule, and says that we can all push past pain, demolish fear, and reach our full potential, and that's really what it's all about, isn't it?
Yes, getting out of our comfort zone and making the uncomfortable comfortable.
So of these 10 books, if somebody asked you to give them something to inspire them on their journey, whether it's a spiritual quest, whether it's a personal, quest for knowledge, about self-knowledge, which is the book that you would recommend the most to inspire somebody?
The funny thing is that the person who would ask me is always morphing. It's because these 10 books are books I've actually recommended to people in different ways. If you're a parent, have definitely How to Raise an Adult, and you can say out of all these books that are in front of me, that's the book that I've recommended the most. Besides, of course, The Four Grins, because he's my papa, of course, and it's helped so much. But How to Raise an Adult is the book that I've recommended the most, because I tend to talk to my peers who are also parents, and in all my teachings, when I talk about the Four Agreements, and they ask me, well, how can I apply it with my kids? And the closest book I have ever read that comes close to being the parent book of the Four Agreements is How to Raise an Adult. Don't take it personal, don't make assumptions, always do your best, and be impeccable with the word. That one, I would say it's the number one book I recommend. To be inspired by and creative quest. Only because it's the difference. As you saw, there's a pattern to this, and Creative Quest and David Goggins Can't Hurt Me. They also go together. If creative QuestLove has done so much. It's like both of them, David Goggins and QuestLove, have, if you look at their body of work, they've made so much, but in different facets. Where QuestLove is in the arts, music, visual stuff, David Goggins is in the personal growth in his physical body, and it's taking him out. Both have taken themselves out of tough places by being themselves. So if I were to recommend that, those two books together would go along. But it always depends on who's asking me. It's like, in the book, The 7 Secrets to Happy, Healthy Relationships, and we talk about, it has one voice. It's co-written with my friend, dear friend, Heather Ashamara, but the book is not a he said, she said. It's one voice that changes gender as the chapters. And one of the reasons why that is that it's not about understanding men and women. It's about understanding the person in front of you. So in order for me to answer which one is according, is I have to see who's in front of me.
Yeah.
And what do they need in that moment? If they need healing, 4 agreements, hands down. If they want to understand life, Will Durant. If they want to deal with kids, How to Raise an Adult in the Autistic Brain, both those books will be will give you insight. And if you want to have this beautiful light that allows you to see the light at the end of the tunnel in regards to autism, then Autistic Brain is your cake. Yeah, it's about understanding who's in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
yeah, and
like
that's a good answer. I mean, it's interesting that your list, I think, really does serve that. It serves every eventuality. I mean, there's other lists and people will pick one book to inspire somebody, but I've not seen such a complete list that seems to cover many different aspects.
Thank you.
It's been a really interesting one to read, to digest. Certainly you've inspired me to read some other books. In closing, I want to go back to where we started at the beginning when we talked about the 5 levels of attachment being, could have been written expressly for this past year and next year. It's difficult, talking about attachments, because it doesn't matter how many we let go of, there's always more, always. But is there one, if you had to write that book today, is there one thing that you would add to it that wasn't there before?
Yes, I actually added it in the Mastery of Self. That's why it's in there again. It's an attachment is a healthy thing when the time comes to let go and you're able to let go of it. It's engaging a moment, and when the moment's over, you're able to disengage, engage, disengage, engage, disengage, attach, detach. That's healthy. It becomes unhealthy the moment when it's time to let go and we can't. And that's when we start holding on to something that no longer exists, and it requires a lot of energy to keep it. If you look back on our life, imagine that you are able to remember every single moment in your life. The thing is that we have to use our imagination because we have forgotten a lot of things. Life allows us to let go, like opening our hand in a river. The river will take it. That means the things we hold on to is because we use energy to keep it. In a good way or in a bad way, impactful, negative, positive, whatever. It takes effort to hold on. But the past only exists because we keep saying yes to it. We keep it alive by using it as an identity, our sense of self, our sense of purpose. But the moment we decide to open up, it'll go away. Just like every thought, every memory we have. The beautiful thing about that is, like my brother uses the analogy. It's like you sit in the river and you open your arm, your hand, and you'll see what the river takes away. If you keep your eye on that thing, that's all you'll see. But it'll prevent you from turning around and seeing what the river brings to you. And that's what life does. As soon as you let go, you're able to engage that which is coming.
Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., it has been beyond a delight to spend this time with you tonight. I really have enjoyed this conversation. You know, there are so many words of praise in the chat room. I don't imagine that you've had a chance to read them, but, you know, everybody has really resonated. There has been everybody who's been, you know, a contributor to the book club has been a wonderful interview, but there has been a layer to this one of such personal openness from you that I think just has really resonated with everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for giving us your list. I know there's a reason why yours is the only list published this month, and it happens to be the month that your book is my bookworm as well. None of that was planned, but it's just turned out that way. So obviously it's divine timing. Thank you.
It is. We live in a beautiful time where we see as humanity, and now we get to choose how do we choose to engage it. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to engage you in the book love. I wish everyone a happy 2021. May life bring joy and wisdom, and we keep in mind everyone we love. You know, this morning I got news that a classmate of mine from elementary middle school passed away from COVID. And he was a guy who, you know, was always happy, always smiling. He leaves behind a child and a wife. And he's young. He's my age. But then again, I feel young, so that's why I was saying he's young. One of the things about accepting death and that every relationship ends is that it helps us not take for granted the relationships we have. Enjoy them. Have fun. Be present and enjoy those moments with the people you love. Tomorrow's not promised, but if you're alive to enjoy it, it's a beautiful present.
Beautiful parting words. Yes, and a wonderful reminder for moving forward. Don Miguel Ruiz, thank you.
Thank you.
And to everybody at home, thank you for joining us. I'm going to leave it here tonight. You know where to find us. If you want to know more about Don Miguel's work, you can go to his website, which is Miguel Ruiz Jr, jr.com. Thank you. Good night, everybody.